I sat in the back of my attorney's car outside the Hennepin County Courthouse and stared at the frosted glass doors like they were the entrance to something I couldn't come back from. My hands were steady. That surprised me. After everything my husband's family had done over the past 4 months, I expected my hands to shake. Instead, I kept thinking about the moment 3 weeks earlier when my mother-in-law sat across from me at her dining room table, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin, and told me she just wanted what was best for my daughter. She said it so gently, so convincingly. That was the thing about her. She never raised her voice. She never had to. She had other people do the screaming for her. Before I tell you exactly what happened in that courtroom, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand what I was walking away from and what I almost let them take. My daughter was 18 months old when my marriage ended. Not ended the way marriages usually end, with fighting and distance and the slow erosion of something that used to matter. It ended the way a building collapses, suddenly, completely, and with a lot of people standing outside watching it happen. My husband, Corbin, had been hiding a second life for most of our 3-year marriage. Not another woman, something worse in its own way. A gambling operation he ran through a fake consulting business he'd set up using my name as a co-signer on the LLC. I found out when the IRS sent a notice to our house addressed to me. The debt was just over $200,000. I had a toddler, a mortgage that was underwater, and a husband who had disappeared to his parents' house in Eden Prairie and stopped answering my calls. What I didn't have was a plan. Not yet. The divorce should have been straightforward. We had no shared assets worth fighting over. Corbin had seen to that. What we had was our daughter Willa, and custody was supposed to be simple too. We'd agreed, verbally, to a 50-50 arrangement while the paperwork was being drafted. Corbin seemed fine with it. Corbin seemed fine with everything, actually, in that loose, relieved way of a man who had just handed his problems to someone else to carry. That someone else turned out to be his mother. I didn't understand the scope of what was coming until a Tuesday morning in late October, when I got a call from my attorney. She told me that Corbin's family had retained a firm, not a local family law attorney, a firm, 4 partners, downtown Minneapolis, to file for a modification of the temporary custody arrangement. The grounds they cited were psychological instability, financial irresponsibility, and a pattern of neglect. I remember standing in my kitchen when she read those words. I remember the refrigerator humming. Willa was in the living room stacking blocks and narrating what she was doing in that half-language toddlers use, half real words and half something she invented herself. Neglect. I put the phone on the counter and breathed through my nose for a full minute before I picked it back up. My mother-in-law's name was on the filing as an interested party. She was petitioning for grandparent visitation rights that, in their framing, would effectively transfer Willa's primary residence to her home. Not Corbin's. Hers. He was listed as a secondary petitioner. I realized then that Corbin wasn't driving anything. He never had been. He was the front. She was the engine. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I want to know who's out there hearing this. To understand why I didn't fall apart in that moment, you have to understand who my mother-in-law is. She's the kind of woman who irons her guest towels. She's the kind of woman who sends handwritten thank you notes within 48 hours and brings homemade soup when anyone in the neighborhood gets sick. She chairs committees. She remembers birthdays. She is, by every surface measurement, a wonderful person, and I spent 3 years of my marriage believing that. The first time I saw what was underneath, Willa was about 6 weeks old. We had brought her to Eden Prairie for Sunday dinner, and I had gone upstairs to nurse her while my mother-in-law finished setting the table. When I came back down, she looked at Willa in my arms and said, very quietly, so that only I could hear, "You know, if you go back to work too soon, she won't attach properly. I've read the research." She smiled when she said it. The smile never wavered. I stood there holding my 6-week-old and nodded and said nothing, because what do you say to something that isn't quite a threat and isn't quite advice? That was the pattern. Always quiet, always reasonable sounding, always landing just precisely enough to leave a mark. When the custody filing came, I did what I think a lot of women in my position do first. I panicked privately and held it together publicly. I showed up to work. I fed Willa her oatmeal. I answered emails and put Willa to bed at 7:30 and then sat in the dark of my living room trying to think through what they actually had on me. The answer rationally was nothing. I had never neglected my daughter. I had never been unstable in any documented way. My finances were a mess because of what Corvin had done, not because of anything I'd done, and I had the paper trail to prove it. But I also knew how this worked. I had watched it happen to a woman I knew from my daughter's pediatric waiting room. A quiet, kind woman who lost 6 months of custody. Not because she was a bad mother, but because her ex-husband's family had money and time, and a story that sounded credible on paper. The legal system is not immune to narrative. If someone tells a story about you convincingly enough, loudly enough, with the right documentation behind it, the story has a way of becoming the starting point. My mother-in-law was very good at telling stories. She had already started telling this one to people in our shared orbit. A mutual friend texted me, awkwardly, to ask if I was doing okay. She'd heard I was going through a hard time. A woman from the pediatric gym where I'd taken Willa mentioned that she'd run into my mother-in-law and that she'd seemed worried about the baby. My own sister-in-law, Corbin's younger sister, sent me a card that said she was thinking of me during this difficult season and didn't specify what season she meant. The picture being painted was not of a scheming grandmother. It was of a concerned family watching a struggling young mother begin to come apart. I sat with that for about a week, and then I got very quiet inside, the way you get quiet when you've stopped panicking and started thinking. There was something my mother-in-law had forgotten, or perhaps had never considered, because she'd never had reason to. I had been documenting things for almost a year before the divorce. Not because I anticipated the divorce specifically. I'd started doing it because of a smaller thing, an incident where she had taken Willa to her pediatrician without telling me, claiming she was just in the neighborhood and thought Willa looked like she might have an ear infection. The pediatrician, who was hers, not ours, had written notes in a file that I didn't know existed. When I found out, something shifted in me. I started keeping records, screenshots of texts, a notebook with dates and what was said. Voice memos on my phone after difficult conversations when I was still in my car in their driveway while my memory was sharp. I had 14 months of documentation. I also had something I hadn't told anyone about yet. About 6 weeks before the filing, I'd been at my mother-in-law's house for what she called a family conversation about the divorce. Corbin was there, his father was there, his sister. It was framed as a mediation, a chance to work things out informally. My attorney had advised me not to go. I went anyway because I wanted to see what they would say without lawyers in the room, and because I had something small clicked to the collar of my cardigan. It looked like an ordinary enamel pin, a little navy and gold crest, the kind you see on blazers. I'd had it modified. The pin had a microphone inside it. The chip was no bigger than my thumbnail, and the audio quality was, according to the person who set it up for me, clear enough to pick up voices at a dinner table from across the room. If they wanted a family conversation, I would give them one. What happened at that table I wasn't fully prepared for. I'd expected pressure. I'd expected veiled threats and concerned language and my mother-in-law's particular brand of soft-voiced control. What I didn't expect was for Corbin's father to slide a document across the table and explain calmly and with the cadence of someone who has rehearsed this, that they were prepared to absorb the IRS debt, all of it, in exchange for a voluntary relinquishment of my custody rights. Not all of them, just primary. They wanted Willa to live with them. They would be generous with my visitation. I looked at the document. I looked at my mother-in-law. She was watching me with an expression I can only describe as patient. The way a person looks when they already know the outcome of something and they're just waiting for you to figure it out. I said I would think about it. I said I needed a few days. My father-in-law nodded like this was reasonable. My mother-in-law reached over and patted my hand and said she knew this was hard and she just wanted what was best for all of them. Then she corrected herself and said for all of us. I drove home with the audio on my pin intact and my hands completely steady on the wheel. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my life, not because of what was happening in the legal case, but because of what they were doing around it. My mother-in-law reached out to my own mother, found her through a church directory, because my mother is the kind of woman who is findable that way, and called her to express concern about me. My mother told me about the call, confused and a little shaken. My mother-in-law had been kind, warm, worried. She said she was afraid I was overwhelmed. She said she just hoped my mother could encourage me to think about what was best for Willa. I sat with my mother at her kitchen table after she told me this and watched her face as she tried to figure out who to believe. That's what I remember most from those weeks. Not the legal pressure, not the four-partner firm filing documents. The look on my mother's face as she tried to reconcile the woman she'd just spoken to on the phone, careful, caring, polished, with the daughter sitting across from her who was saying something entirely different, was happening. I didn't cry. I said, "Mom, I need you to trust me for about 2 more weeks. Can you do that?" She said yes. She said it without hesitation, and that undid me more than anything else had. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. My attorney, who had by this point reviewed all 14 months of documentation and spent 3 evenings listening to the audio from the pin, told me to dress simply, speak slowly, and let her do the talking. She told me that what we had was significant, but that family court was unpredictable, and she wanted me to be prepared for any outcome. I told her I understood. I didn't tell her about the second recording. The week before the hearing, I had received a call from my mother-in-law. She said she wanted to speak with me privately, woman to woman, before things got formal and difficult. She suggested coffee. I suggested her house because I knew the layout and I knew where the quiet corners were. I wore the pin. She poured the coffee herself in real mugs, not the good china. That was a choice. That was her being informal, relatable, just 2 women having a conversation. She sat across from me at the kitchen island and she looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I wasn't prepared for. She said she had never thought I was a bad mother. She said that wasn't what this was about. She said that Corbin needed to be protected, that the IRS situation had the potential to affect not just me, but the entire family's reputation, and that if I were Willa's primary parent, the scrutiny would extend to all of them. She said she needed Willa close so that she could, and this is the part I made sure the pin was positioned for, manage the narrative going forward. She said the filing wasn't about my fitness as a mother, it was about liability management. She said, "You're a smart woman. I think you understand that." I looked at her. I held my coffee mug with both hands. I said, "I do understand that." Then I drove home and transferred the audio file to my attorney's secure portal within the hour. I want to tell you about the moment in the courtroom when the recording played for the first time, because I want you to understand what happened not just externally, but to me, sitting at that table. My mother-in-law had been on the stand for 40 minutes. She was composed and specific and quietly devastating, painting a picture of a mother who was overwhelmed, financially compromised, emotionally erratic, a woman who meant well but who was simply not equipped. Her attorney, who was very good, had walked her through it like a guided meditation, soft and methodical. The judge was attentive. Corbin sat at the other table with his hands folded and his face arranged into something that looked like grief. When my attorney stood and said she had an audio recording she would like to introduce into evidence, the room shifted the way rooms do when something changes temperature. The other attorney objected. There was a sidebar. The judge reviewed the documentation on the recording's provenance, the date, the location, the chain of custody, and then he looked over his glasses and he said he would allow it. My mother-in-law's face, up to that point, had been perfectly arranged. When the audio began to play, her own voice, in her own kitchen, in her own carefully chosen informal mugs, I watched something leave her face. Not panic, not guilt. Something earlier than that. Recognition. The recognition that the story she had been telling was about to be interrupted by a version she couldn't control. She said on the recording, "The filing wasn't about your fitness as a mother. It was about liability management." The courtroom was very quiet. Her attorney asked for a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, I sat still at the table and looked at my hands. My attorney put a hand briefly on my shoulder. Across the room, I could see Corbin leaning toward his mother, speaking close to her ear, and I watched her shake her head. Once, the way she did when something was not going according to plan, and she needed to recalibrate. When court resumed, my attorney introduced the second component of our evidence, the documentation from the unauthorized pediatric visit 2 years prior, which had been coordinated with the family's own physician and had included notes that characterized me, without my knowledge or consent, as an anxious new mother with difficulty establishing authority. That note was in a file I had never seen and had never signed off on. My attorney also introduced 12 months of text records in which my mother-in-law coordinated with Corbin's sister about the timing of the custody filing in relation to my employment status. They had planned to wait until my contract position ended so that I would appear financially vulnerable at the time of the hearing. The judge asked one question. He looked at my mother-in-law's attorney and he said, "Is there any evidence of harm to the child?" There was a pause. Her attorney said no, but that there were concerns. The judge held up one hand. "Concerns are not evidence," he said. "Liability management is not a custody standard." He ruled in my favor that afternoon. Primary custody to me, standard parenting time to Corbin, grandparent visitation denied pending a separate review. The 4-partner firm from downtown Minneapolis did not speak again after the ruling was read. I walked out of the Hennepin County Courthouse into November air that was cold and clean and sharp in my lungs. My attorney was on the phone beside me. A woman I'd never met held the door open for me and I thanked her, and she had no idea what I had just walked out of. I called my mother from the parking lot. She answered on the first ring. When I told her, she didn't say "I told you so," because she had told me nothing. She had just trusted me, 2 weeks earlier, across a kitchen table. She said, "Okay, baby," and I could hear her breathing, and I held the phone against my ear for a long moment without saying anything else. "There's a coda to this I want to give you, because you deserve to know how it sits now." My mother-in-law sent me a card 3 weeks after the ruling. Handwritten, as always. It said she hoped Willa was doing well and that she hoped I knew there were no hard feelings. It was 3 sentences. The handwriting was very neat. I put it in the same folder where I keep all the other documentation. Not as a weapon, not for any future proceeding, though my attorney suggested I might want it there just in case. I keep it because I want to remember clearly what that family believed about power. That it was something you accumulated through access to other people's children, that love was a language you could use to justify almost anything if you said it calmly enough and in the right room. Willow's 3 now. She calls me Mama with the full force of her entire small body. Last week she handed me a crayon drawing of what she said was our house and pointed out the little yellow square she put in for a window, because that's where the light is. I kept the enamel pin. I still have it in a small dish on my dresser. I don't need it anymore. But I keep it to remind myself of something I learned in that season, that silence, when it's chosen and not imposed, is one of the most powerful things you can carry into a room. They expected me to be loud with my fear so that they could be quiet with their plan. I flipped it. I let them talk, and they told me everything I needed to know. I still think about the enamel pin sitting in that little dish on my dresser. It's such a small thing, navy and gold, the kind of detail nobody notices. And that's exactly why it worked, because they never thought to look at what I was quietly carrying. There's something I've come to understand about the way my mother-in-law operated, and it has nothing to do with winning or losing. She believed that control was a form of love. Not consciously, maybe, but somewhere underneath all the iron guest towels and the handwritten notes and the careful, measured voice, she genuinely believed that managing people, their choices, their children, their stories, was the same thing as caring for them. That's what made her dangerous. Not malice. Conviction. And that's the part I had to reckon with in myself, too, because I spent a long time being angry at the wrong thing. I was angry at her tactics. But the tactics were just tactics. What I really had to look at was the question of why it worked for as long as it did. Why I nodded in the kitchen when she made the comment about nursing. Why I stayed quiet through the unauthorized pediatric visit. Why I went to that family conversation without telling my attorney. I kept choosing the path of least resistance because I told myself it was keeping the peace. It wasn't. It was just deferring the cost. The thing about that kind of slow, quiet pressure is that it trains you to doubt your own clarity. By the time Corbin's father slid that document across the table, I had been second-guessing my own perceptions for 3 years. That's what they were counting on. That I would be too worn down, too financially exposed, too desperate for the debt to disappear, to think straight. They mistook my exhaustion for weakness. They didn't know I'd been taking notes. What carried me through wasn't confidence. I want to be honest about that. I didn't walk into that courthouse feeling certain. I walked in feeling something closer to resolve, the kind that doesn't feel like strength in the moment, but that moves your feet anyway. There's a difference between being fearless and being unwilling to stop. I was never fearless. I was just unwilling to stop. And I want to say something about the 14 months of documentation, because I think people hear she kept records and imagine some calculating, premeditated strategy. It didn't feel like that. It started because something felt wrong and I didn't trust that the feeling would be believed without evidence. I started writing things down because I was a woman who knew, from watching other women, that feelings without receipts tend to disappear in rooms where other people have lawyers. That's not cynicism. That's just paying attention. Willa will never know the version of this story where I didn't document. She'll never know what almost happened. That's the outcome I want for her, not knowing, because there's nothing to know. Just a mother who showed up and kept showing up and didn't let the paperwork outlast her. I think about what I want her to understand someday when she's old enough. Not the legal details, not the depositions or the recordings or the judge's ruling. I want her to understand that the right thing is rarely the easy thing, and that doing it anyway, doing it quietly, methodically, without performance, is its own kind of power. That how you treat people when you think no one is watching is the only version of your character that actually counts. And that the truth doesn't need you to shout it. It just needs you to preserve it long enough to be heard. The pin is still in the dish. I don't need it anymore. But some mornings I look at it and feel something close to gratitude. Not for what happened, but for the version of myself who thought to wear it.